everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Natalia Karina. I am a Vice President of Client Services at CBIZ Gibraltar, which is a conflict-free tenant representation firm. And today we are joined by our Senior Vice President, Eric Galanti, as well as Megan Spinos of Vocon, an architecture firm. And we're going to be discussing strategies for a safe, productive, and sustainable return back to the workplace. So Megan, Eric, thank you so much for being with us today. We really are so glad to have you on.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Natalia. Good to be here.
Of course. And just before we get started, if you guys want to take a few moments, just introduce yourselves, give us a little bit of background on your roles, responsibilities before we get going, that would be great. So, Megan, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks for having us. So my name is Megan Spinos, and I'm Strategy Director at Vocon. My background is in interior design. I've been with our firm for about 13 years, and our firm is really at the forefront of kind of corporate interiors, workplace design. And so we've been very involved in the last, I would say, 10, 12 weeks in thinking about what COVID is going to have an impact, what the impact's going to be for our large global clients, our large national clients. So my job at the firm for our clients and also for our own firm as well is to help organizations make decisions about space that impacts both their business and their employee experience. So this has been a really interesting time to start to leverage sort of our knowledge about workplace and what's coming in the future, and then crash land this experience on top of all of the development that we've been working towards. So I'm really excited to share some of our points of view and what can be helpful to the audience going forward.
Yeah, we're definitely excited to have you on. Thank you, Megan. And Eric, you want to give us a little bit of a background on you?
Sure, absolutely. So, Natalia, as you mentioned, CBIZ Gibraltar, we're an exclusive tenant representation firm, so we help companies from start to finish evaluate their office space, how much space they need, from A to Z negotiations, whether it be renewals or leases for new offices. So the last two and a half months have been has been pretty crazy for us as well. As companies look to embark on getting back to the office, there are so many questions and there's been so many unknowns over the last several months. We've really been concentrating on, assisting our clients. The first 30 days were really, some rent relief discussions. What rights do I have within my lease? And now, as Megan said, and as we sit here today, we're talking about, what is this new normal going to look like as we get back to the office, not only from, a culture perspective, but how are our spaces going to look different today and in the future? So really happy to be here to share some insights.
Yeah, thank you, guys. And so just before we get started, 2 housekeeping tasks really quickly. So we are definitely going to have a Q&A in this. So if throughout this entire webinar, as Megan and Eric are giving their insight, you have a question for either one of them, feel free to leave it in the chat, and we'll save 5 to 10 minutes after we wrap up just to kind of answer some of the questions that you may have. And in addition to that, we are going to be sending everyone that's logged in a recording of this. So if you want to share it, distribute it with others, if someone that can't log in now, you'll definitely have a recording of this available to you. And so just now, I guess we can begin without further ado. So, as you both have mentioned now, there's just been so much change within the commercial real estate industry amid this COVID-19 pandemic, between sheltering in place, heavy restrictions, a lot of employees moving from the physical to the remote work environment. And so there's just been so many questions that employees are asking. And so I'm glad to have you guys here to be able to shed some light on those questions. And so kind of just to start off, what should companies do now to prepare, communicate, and transition employees back into their office as states are reopening and phasing that in now?
Yeah.
And one of you can kind of jump in at any point.
I'll go.
Megan, go ahead.
Okay. I think it's important to think about, obviously, so we're talking about the short term. And when we think of the short term, we're thinking, the immediate till the next maybe 12, 16 weeks. So we can talk about the long term, our perspective on the long term, after this. But I think there's a couple ways to think about this. One, you have to prepare your building or your facility, and then you have to prepare your workforce. When you start to think about it in those two senses, what have you been doing? Either you're an enterprise, tenant, or you're your landlord, those relationships are really critical right now, and they always have been, but I don't think they've ever been more important than, both sides of the same coin, because if you're a tenant, you can't get your people into your space without the partnership of your landlord. So those synergies are really important. So taking those measures to make sure that the building is safe and healthy to come back to, and then really over communicating with your workforce. So from a building perspective, have you done that deep cleaning? Are you doing those physical distancing plans, those circulation plans? Are you controlling access to the building or to your space, and all of those protocols that are in place? And then really level setting with employees in an overly communicative way, can't stress that enough, of here's what informed the plan, here's how we're coming back, whether it's in a shift. At VOCON, we're coming back starting next week in Ohio. Our New York office will be a little bit later, but we'll be taking an approach of either you're this shift or that shift, and this shift has access on these days, and this shift has access on the other days. And that's really based on our capacity that we're able to accommodate through our physical distancing plan. So a lot of those things are quite a few organizations have their teams in place. They're back to workplace teams. We've all been working, so we say back to workplace. So just as a starting point, what are those 2 avenues that you've done that you can share very freely with your workforce so that they feel comfortable? I think the overall message here is, yes, we are going to, we've not been in contact with anyone that hasn't really taken a very thoughtful, curated, careful approach. The goal now is to reduce fear. We want to be safe and pragmatic, and if you can do so in a way that helps people feel comfortable while leaving them out, of course, but really making people feel less scared to come to the office because you've done the right thing is really important. Eric?
Yeah.
Yeah, so to Megan's point, I think over the last several months, most tenants have been communicating with their landlord in one way or another. Again, the first couple weeks was a lot of questions about rent relief, and there's a lot of times where tenants don't communicate with their landlords, and I do think that that's key, is understanding and communicating not only with your landlord but then communicating with your workforce. What is the landlord doing? Because there's one thing when you walk in your office building and you make your way from the parking garage to the elevator banks or the food service or the retail within the office building, but then as you make your way up to the space, it's going to be each organization and company's responsibility to enact measures to make the workplace safe. So, but when you walk in your building, your landlord has to communicate, oh, here's what we're doing with elevator lobbies. We've seen a lot of some touchless technologies with doors, so people aren't touching things. A lot of protocol regarding elevators, maximum capacity. I know our building, we pack them in the morning, but I think that's not going to be the case anymore. So there's going to be a limit on the number of people in elevators and in common spaces, and definitely, over communicate with your landlord, and also transition that communication to your employees, because it's so important that your employees feel that you as a company are doing something to make them safe and taking measures to make sure that the workplace is clean, it's sanitized, and everybody's kind of working together to get to that common goal.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. In terms of, things like common elevators, lobbies, you addressed that, but what about, kitchens, cafes, break rooms within the actual physical office space? Whose responsibility is that to keep clean, and what are the measures being taken there?
I think if you look at it from a tenant responsibility, it's the tenant space. What we've been seeing is definitely an uptick in those cleaning protocols. So we have the benefit, I'm based in Cleveland, to have the Cleveland Clinic and University Hospitals both in our backyard. And so we've been working very closely with both organizations to understand what their recommendations are. And their advice is always, or has been during this period, has been, you should, if you were cleaning your office 3 times a day, you should really up that to one time a day. You should really up that to 3 times a day, the beginning, the middle, and the end, and enlist your workforce to help do that. So at VOCON, we will be, we have a concierge staff, an office team that will be, helping us do that a little more frequently. But those common sense protocols about cafes, you may, for the short term, again, we're talking about the short term, eliminate the ability to dine in your cafes and those kitchen spaces and really have them for very intentional purposes. Go get coffee, go heat up your lunch, but really trying to eliminate all of those touch points, because that's really where the concern comes in. So we've replaced, and advocated replacing kind of your permanent dishware with compostable, so that you can eliminate some of those touch points, using styluses so you can help people. Our company's giving them to all of us, which we're really grateful for. But so you're using sort of a surrogate finger to kind of do the touch options on, coffee machines and printers and those types of things. So some of those spaces are going to have the same layer of common sense that we've seen some of the restaurants start to open, and just doing that complete audit of walking through before everyone comes back, and saying, what are all the ways that we can touch and, access, limit capacity, and define what the rules are. The other thing that we've been saying is, we're going to be really bad at this at the very beginning. We're probably not going to remember all of the protocols, but if we, really have our intentions the right way, we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out together.
Definitely. And just kind of to shift focus a little bit in terms of, space evaluation, obviously with so many people shifting from the physical to the remote work environment, how, Eric, how do you think that this will, impact square footage? And then, is there going to be a shift more from an open concept to a private office space? What is that going to look like?
Well, the answer to that is it's going to be a fluid process. People are figuring it out right now. There's been so many reports out there about, different types of furniture systems. The reality is for a company to go in and replace their entire furniture system, it is extremely expensive. Just given the economic climate we're in right now, and I think everybody's focus is really getting back to work and getting the country back into some sort of normalcy. We just don't see companies opening up their checkbooks to incur huge capital expenditures as it relates to completely redoing their space and furniture. But in the short term, there's definitely going to be some social distance practicing. If you have benching stations, placing everybody, every other workstation. And as Megan said, shift work, having different employees coming back in different parts of the day or of the week. But from a office space perspective and evaluating your space needs long term, you can kind of say, hey, look, maybe our employee count is going to be cut by 50%. What most companies don't understand is that doesn't mean that their space is going to be cut by 50%. It'll equate to about a 60% reduction of the percentage of your employee count. So let's say you were reducing your employee count by 20%. That would equate to about a 12% less need for square footage. Or if it was a 30% reduction, it'd be 18%. So it's not a one-for-one, which is just kind of comes to mind as you say, hey, our workforce can be cut by half. Does not necessarily mean that your space needs are going to be cut in half. But from a programming perspective, which we help a ton of our clients with, we're definitely going to find ourselves potentially maybe needing a little bit more space to spread out and to social distance and to make sure that everybody is safe and working in safe distances. Same thing with conference rooms. There may be, and Megan, you can certainly speak to this, but from a design standpoint, the days of having a huge conference room table that has a ton of surface area, that conference room table might shrink a little bit just to be less surface area, less area to clean, and less people sitting around the conference room table.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, so definitely thinking about materiality and less surfaces to clean, but we also may have a larger population that's going to be remote. What we've found, so we've done a bit of survey work that, and obviously we've all been in the remote work experience now for the last, couple of months, but as you start to boomerang back, we think that there's going to be probably a quarter to a third that organizations may consider saying, okay, either this might be toying with the idea, this might be a more permanent work from home role because the structure of the role is very independent. It doesn't require tons of collaboration with others. Or what we found most often was that people kind of liked the idea of a day or two or very minor amount or moderate amount of work from home capability, because they liked the flexibility and they appreciated what they called the increase in productivity. We didn't define productivity, we let them define it. So I think you're going to see kind of this adoption. There's a silver lining to this experience. And if people felt like they had more control over their day, you would then accommodate them in the workplace in a little bit different way. So if they were only in a few days a week, they may not get a fully assigned workspace, which is also going to completely, shift our thinking around programming. But I wanted to sort of add on what you were starting to say at the beginning about, do organizations kind of open up their checkbook and start to rethink furniture altogether? And we would emphatically say, no, before we start redesigning the complete floor plate, let's take a pause. Really think pragmatically over what's going to happen in the long term. So the best advice we would give is that don't overreach with this and start to, throw out all those standards, because we will, like I said, boomerang back to a certain point. There's going to be a lot of great lessons that we're learning over these next couple of months. But the workplace has and always, we believe, will continue to have a purpose. Its purpose may not always be for quiet, focused individual work. Seems like we can do some of that at home or in another location. So we'll see kind of a more refinement of the intentionality of the workplace as a place to bring people together, to collaborate, to interact, but then have that connection to a remote workforce, which now, they're not a second-class citizen. They're right on par with our, the people that are present in the workplace as well. So we've got to kind of bridge that gap.
Definitely.
Yeah,
And just,
I would totally agree. I mean, a fragmented workplace is what we're finding, as people start to get back to work. While everybody's working remotely, it's okay. I mean, everybody's really getting by. But when some people are back to work and others aren't, it's going to make it super challenging. So I agree with you 100% that, there's got to be that communication and the collaboration and figuring out it's okay to work from home, but knowing that the office is a place that people are going to come because it always has been.
Yeah, right.
Definitely. And just to switch focus just a tiny bit, in terms of, tenants with leases that are expiring in the near future, what have you thought of in terms of, negotiations with landlords? What is that looking like right now? And, how is this shifting to the remote work environment impacted those conversations?
Sure. So, leasing markets, and this is really coast to coast, we're really at an all-time high at the beginning of the year. Most markets in the country had their lowest vacancy and most leasing activity the first couple months, and then there was a pretty dramatic fall in March, and then the numbers just are coming in for April and May, and they've kind of plummeted at this point. So the question is, well, where does this leave us in the market? And overall, we're not really expecting a huge discount in actual rental rates, but we do think that landlords are going to be more receptive to additional free rent and TI. One thing, and I'll go to current tenants that have, that are currently in negotiations with their landlord in a second, but we might actually see a flight to some higher quality buildings. We talk about all these changes to the common areas of the buildings and these touchless entry systems and elevator systems, all of which are very expensive and really only found in, Class A, very nice buildings. And to make those changes in lower quality buildings is going to be very expensive. And also sometimes those landlords don't have the appetite to, make their asset the best in the market with the best technology. So we might actually see a little bit of a flight. Perhaps it might be a little bit less square footage, but a little bit more expensive building to that higher quality building. And then, we have been over the last couple months, we have clients that have leases expiring all the time. So even during this couple month period where they're currently in negotiations with their landlord, and a lot of our clients have said, well, what happens if the market takes? What happens if we sign this lease and we're about to sign a 10-year lease and we find ourselves in a bottoming market over the next 12 to 18 months. So we've been able to successfully negotiate what's called, favored nations or market fluctuation language, which, essentially says if you're going to sign the deal today, which landlords are all over because there aren't very many tenants that are in a position to sign long-term commitments right now. But if you do, and someone comes in and perhaps negotiates a better deal, or the market tanks, that your rate and net effective rate will essentially be adjusted down to that level over a certain period of time. And that period of time is usually pretty short, but it provides a little bit of stability and comfort for the tenant's perspective, knowing that they're not signing a lease in, a bottoming market.
Definitely. And I just definitely want to leave some room for Q&A before. So maybe we'll just wrap it up on our end with this one last question, and then we can open it up to the audience for questions. But just looking into the future of everything and how, looking ahead, and, what do you guys envision the new normal looking like when this pandemic is behind us? And, how, as the phases of, shelter in place ease up, what do you envision for that?
I will go. Well, first, I think we should have a drinking game about whenever we hear the new normal or unprecedented times. We should. But it is true. It's totally true. So I think there's a couple of impacts, like long-term impacts to the planning and then design. So from a planning perspective, I kind of mentioned, I think the workplace is going to have a much more purposeful meaning. We're going to be there for intention, and other work that we can do somewhere else is going to be, we're going to be able to do that. I also mentioned I think the remote work is going to have a greater presence. To what percentage, I think the organizations will start to figure that out. If we're doing shared desking from a planning perspective, which I know is always a concern, we don't have quite as many people on site permanently. Could they share a desk? That would have to come with really robust cleaning protocols. So it's always, that can happen, from a hot desking perspective, but we would just need to make sure that those cleaning protocols are in there. And then I think we're going to have to figure out how to, we're reoccupying the workplace. We may have to figure out how to deoccupy the workplace and go back and forth if these hot spots start to crop up. But from a design perspective, I think you're going to see a better influence of healthcare on, in workplace design. There's so many great materials that have been used for years in healthcare that may become more mainstream. The touchless entries, Eric was starting to talk about, just thinking about how you get through a space and all the times that we touch doors and handles and all of those kinds of things, not, speaking to ADA, that will always be there, but we're going to be thinking about that in a different way. 9/11 made a big impact on us regarding security and surveillance, and we're going to see that second level of public health start to come to the fore. So more commonplace to have those health screenings. You're seeing it in Asia Pacific region, where you're taking your temperature, or you're doing a health screening before you enter. And just more areas that are secure drop-off, thinking more pragmatically around how we're accessing and occupying our tenant spaces with a bit more distancing, but we're not going to extremes, I think, for the long term, because we really think, workplace is a place for choice. And we're going to get to a point where those health measures are going to serve us in the long run. And we're going to have vaccines and really try to get back to some semblance of what is a new, meaning for workplace. Eric,
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think those are great from a design standpoint. The more that we talk to clients, I know that Vocon has done a pretty extensive survey of a lot of their clients. Our company, CEBA, is 2,500 employees. We've done a lot of surveying over the last couple months about how the working from home's going and getting back to the office. And overall, I think there was an 85 or 86% positive attitude about wanting to return to the office, so long as the proper measures were taken. So I think people they're rearing to get back to the office, and it's going to be a slow process. And as these phase approaches take place, it's going to be slow and methodical. But as long as everybody's safe and we get back, everybody that we talk to is really looking forward to that.
Definitely. I know that we are, and I think some of our offices across the country have already started to make the transition, and the rest will follow suit shortly. So I'm very curious to see how that will go. And just kind of to open it up to some questions, I think we have time for maybe one or two, depending on how quickly we can get through it. But a lot of the questions that we've been getting have been around plexiglass screens and how effective those are, and in workstations, should we be using them? Should companies implement them? Megan, do you have any comments in terms of that?
Yeah, I think we've seen it as a reasonably reasonable cost interim measure to help build that barrier between workstations. So one, if you've got your physical distancing and maybe you're doing the checkerboard or every other desk to help put that minimum 6 foot distance, it does assist, in the short term, and it's a low cost intervention. We saw some product the other day that it was kind of a really interesting looking cardboard cutout, which is like a huge cardboard that I got a box from Amazon and I'm making it into a workstation panel, but actually it was a little bit more decorative and does the same kind of thing. It also helps from the psychological aspect of mitigating fear. I mentioned it before, but also that sense of protection. It does help. It does help as long as it's cleaned and maintained properly to give people a little bit more degree of enclosure in the short term, for sure.
Definitely. And then one for Eric in terms of, our rule of thumb for figuring out how much square footage you need going forward to account for less density and increased work remote. I know we kind of covered this a little bit in the beginning, but if you just want to kind of shed more light if there's going to be some sort of a standard or how you envision that going.
Sure. As I mentioned, again, it's not a one-for-one reduction if you're cutting back your employee count, but over the last several decades, the per square foot per employee metric that so many companies use has continued to decline as we've moved to benching stations and more just dense populations. So I think as we get out of this, people are going to bring into account the potential work from home, and hoteling, I think, is really going to play a key role here. People want to be in the office. People have always wanted to be in the office and have been leasing space for decades because of the collaboration and the face-to-face interaction. And while Zoom and these webinars are fantastic, people want to be there. So I think there'll be a big push to hoteling, and also just a little bit more spread out workstations and more collaborative areas within a space where you can have a meeting, and again, low touch points, maybe a high top table as opposed to a big conference room table. So I wouldn't say there's a rule of thumb of how much space people are going to need on a per square foot per person basis, but we don't see, there was a lot of talk about, all these, from a space plan perspective, there's going to be a ton more private offices. I don't see that, Megan. I don't know what your perspective is on it. I just don't see, companies that have an open floor plan put in a bunch of private offices. It creates a different type of workplace, less collaborative. I do think that perhaps private offices might get a little bit smaller, but we don't see a massive change like that happening.
Yeah, we would agree.
Yeah. And then just to, in terms of the sublease spaces coming on the market, what are just kind of the comments on that? We've seen big blocks of space come available really recently. Why are we seeing that? Just kind of what is your comment around that? Is that something that's going to continue to happen? Will that ease off?
Sure. I mean, this is a purely economic factor, as this pandemic has hit everybody so hard. For instance, in Chicago, we've had about 1 million square feet of sublease space come on the market since in the last 60 days. And that's really coast to coast. So I think from a market perspective, there'll definitely be a plethora of subleases, although I think they're going to be large blocks of space. The career builders of the world, the Grubhubs, those are the types of users are going to be putting their space on the market. But definitely going to be an increase in sublease inventory. But again, keep in mind, this sublease space is typically space that is very, very dense with benching stations. So the same sort of redesign will need to take place when evaluating those subleases.
Great, thank you. So I think that's kind of all the time that we have left for today. Well, I really want to thank Megan and Eric for being able to tune in. I think you had some really insightful feedback to us, and I'm sure that we can't all wait to put it into effect and see how it evolves and what kind of happens. So thank you so much for being able to be here with us, and thank you all the attendings for joining in and tuning in. As I mentioned, this will be recorded and everyone will get a recording. But yeah, thank you guys. Really appreciate it. I thought this was really useful and really informative.
Thanks. Appreciate being asked.
Yeah, of course. Well,
Thank you, Natalia. Thanks,
rest of your
Megan.
week.
It's been great.
Thanks, Eric and Natalia.
Thank you. Well, signing out. Thank you guys for all tuning in. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.